Look at what just walked back into the room. You, the one they scripted out of the story. The one they quietly, carefully, surgically removed from every plan, every conversation, every table where decisions were being made. You, the one they whispered about in hallways with their mouths barely moving, their eyes scanning the room to make sure you weren't close enough to hear. You, the one they built an entire architecture of silence around. Because as long as you stayed quiet, as long as you stayed confused, as long as you stayed in the dark, they were safe. And then you opened your mouth. One sentence. And everything they spent months constructing crumbled in under 60 seconds. Before we go any further, the script is drawn from the Joker Doctrine, the art of the last laugh. A doctrine built not for the fragile, not for the ones who fold under pressure, but for those who have been underestimated so many times that the underestimation itself became snorts, their greatest weapon. The Joker Doctrine is not about chaos for chaos's sake. It is about the precise, calculated art of holding your power until the moment it matters most, and then without warning, without announcement, without mercy, laughing last. Let that sink in for just a moment. Not a lawsuit, not an expose, not a revenge campaign, or a public breakdown, or a dramatic confrontation in a crowded room. One sentence. That's all it took. Because here is what the architects of your destruction never calculated into their perfectly engineered plan. They studied your weaknesses obsessively. They mapped your silences like graphers. They memorized your flinches like scholars. But they never, not once, studied your clarity. They forgot that a person who has been silent long enough doesn't just speak. They detonate. Understand what they built before we talk about what fell. Their strategy wasn't improvised. It wasn't careless. It wasn't the work of amateur saboteurs acting on impulse and ego alone. No, what they constructed against you was deliberate, layered, patient, and almost beautiful in its cruelty. They spent real time on this. They had meetings, silent agreements, carefully worded messages that left just enough ambiguity to be deniable. They had allies, people who smiled at you warmly while passing information behind your back, like folded notes under a classroom desk. They controlled the narrative before you even knew there was a narrative to control. They framed you before you had a chance to introduce yourself. They planted seeds of doubt in rooms you never entered, with people you trusted, in conversations you would never be invited to review or respond to. That is not chaos. That is architecture. That is a blueprint. That is the kind of calculated, methodical, slow-burning sabotage that only people who are genuinely afraid of you are capable of producing, because only someone who recognizes your power built walls this elaborate to contain it. They were certain. Let that word land properly. CERTAIN. They were not guessing. They were not hoping. They had convinced themselves, somewhere between the third and fourth revision of their strategy, that they had accounted for every variable. They had plugged every gap. They had silenced every witness. They had rewritten every version of the story in which you came out with your dignity intact. And they had replaced those versions with a single unified airtight narrative. One in which who were the problem, the liability, the one who couldn't be trusted, the one who had to go. And for a while it seemed to be working. For a while the architecture held. But here is the fundamental error every brilliant strategist makes when they are building their plans on a foundation of fear rather than truth. Fear makes you thorough. Fear makes you careful. Fear makes you meticulous about covering every angle. But fear also makes you blind to the one thing you're most afraid of. And what they were most afraid of was you speaking specifically clearly without apology or hesitation or the emotional tremor they had been counting on. They thought they had taken everything from you. They forgot that the one thing they could never confiscate was the version of events that actually happened. Let's talk about your silence, because they misread it so catastrophically. They watched you go quiet, and they translated that silence as surrender. They saw you stop arguing, and they called it defeat. They watched you withdraw from the spaces where their whisper campaigns were loudest, and they celebrated your absence like a military victory, like a flag planted in conquered territory, like proof that their strategy had worked exactly as intended. They popped the metaphorical champagne over your silence. They promoted it. They pointed to it as evidence of your guilt. What they didn't understand is that there are two kinds of silence in this world. There is the silence of someone who has nothing left to say because they have been broken beyond the ability to form language. That silence smells like defeat. It has a particular quality of hollowness to it, a flatness, an absence not just of words but of presence. And then there is the other kind, the silence of someone who is watching, collecting, organizing. The silence of someone who has realized that every word they speak in a battlefield their enemy has chosen is a bullet spent on someone else's terms. That silence is not hollow. It is dense. It is pressurized. It vibrates. Your silence vibrated. You were not absent during those months. You were present in a way that didn't require performance. You were in the corner of every room they thought they had cleared. Not physically, not visibly, but in the specific way that truth occupies space. Even when no one is speaking it aloud, you were accumulating clarity the way a storm accumulates pressure. Not dramatically, not with advance warning, not with any of the theatrical signals they were watching for. You were becoming something they had not prepared a response for. You were becoming undeniable. And here's the thing about people who construct elaborate strategies to silence someone. They require that person's silence to continue indefinitely. The whole system depends on it. Every lie that was told, every alliance that was built on distorted versions of your story. Every person who was handed a curated image of you that had been deliberately stripped of context. All of it requires your silence as its operating condition. The moment you speak with clarity and specificity in the unshakable calm of someone who has had a very long time to think, the whole system experiences its first crack. And cracks do not stop at one. Now let's get into the sentence itself, not the specific words, because your sentence belongs to you. And every person watching this has their own version of it, waiting somewhere in the architecture of their chest, like a locked room they haven't opened yet. What matters is the nature of the sentence. What made it so precise, so devastatingly surgical, so irreversible. The sentence that breaks a perfect strategy is never loud. It is never delivered with tears or rage or the shaking voice of someone who has been wounded for a long time and is finally erupting. No. The sentence that cracks an empire is delivered the way a surgeon makes an incision. Quietly, deliberately, without drama, with absolute knowledge of exactly where the cut needs to go. They had prepared for your anger. They had been hoping for it, frankly, because anger is manageable. Anger looks unstable. Anger looks unstable. Anger gives them the image they'd been constructing of you. Reactive, emotional, impossible to work with. A person who loses control under pressure. They had entire responses preloaded for your anger. If you erupted, they were ready to nod slowly and say, "See, this is exactly the behavior we were concerned about." They had made peace with the version of this moment where you raised your voice, where you accused them publicly, where you fell into the emotional register they had assigned you in their narrative. They were not ready for the version where you simply told the truth calmly with evidence, with names, with dates. Because here is what happens to a carefully constructed lie when it meets a precise truth delivered without emotion. The lie does not put up a fight. It does not defend itself. It does not argue or negotiate or attempt to reframe. It just becomes visible. Suddenly, every person in the room who had been operating on the version of reality that your silence had allowed to exist without challenge now has to make a very uncomfortable choice. They have to decide whether they saw what they just saw. They have to decide whether they heard what they just heard. They have to decide whether to continue maintaining a story that has just in front of their eyes been revealed as engineered. And that moment, that precise moment of decision, that is where empires crack. You didn't just speak. You changed the physics of the room. You altered what was possible to pretend. You did the one thing that a perfect strategy built on someone else's silence absolutely cannot survive. You removed the silence, and without your silence as its foundation, the whole structure had nothing to stand on. The lies needed your quiet. The alliances needed your absence from the story. The narrative they had constructed needed you to remain a character described by others rather than a person capable of describing yourself. One sentence from you and every single one of those requirements became impossible to fulfill simultaneously. Here is what nobody tells you about the moment an empire built on someone's silence finally hears that person's voice. It doesn't collapse all at once. It doesn't fall in a single dramatic implosion that everyone witnesses simultaneously. It cracks quietly, then all at once. First, one person who had been holding the weight of the lie starts putting it down. Not publicly, not with any announcement, just internally. They begin the process of recalibrating. They start replaying conversations they had been given. They start noticing the gaps in the version of you that they were handed. They start asking themselves very privately, very carefully, what else might have been shaped before they received it. Then another person does the same, and then another. And none of them are talking to each other about it yet because the machinery of the strategy is still technically running, still producing its outputs, still manufacturing the appearance of a unified front. But internally, in the private spaces where people think their actual thoughts rather than the thoughts they are supposed to have, the doubt is spreading like water finding its way through concrete, like a frequency traveling through walls. Invisible until suddenly it isn't. Until suddenly, the unified front has hairline fractures that everyone can see, but no one is allowed to acknowledge yet. Until suddenly, the performances start getting slightly less convincing. Watch for the signs because they are always there after the sentence has been spoken. Watch for the person who used to look straight through you and now cannot quite hold eye contact. Watch for the sudden softening in someone who was previously mechanical in their coldness toward you, as if they are recalibrating the energy they are allowed to give you now that the story has a complication. Watch for the ones who were loudest in the campaign against you going unusually quiet, not because they've admitted anything, but because speaking requires confidence in the version of events you're speaking from. And the version they've been using has just developed a structural problem. And the ones at the center, the architects, the strategists, the ones who designed the original plan and held a blueprint, watch what happens to their certainty. the certainty that was their defining characteristic, the certainty that made them walk into rooms with that particular quality of unhurried confidence, the certainty that made their lies sound like obvious truths because they delivered them with such absolute conviction that certainty is now performing. It's no longer natural. It's now a mask they're holding over a face that is gone uncertain. And holding a mask requires both hands, which means they're no longer free to build with them. Now we need to discuss something that they genuinely, fundamentally, catastrophically miscalculated. They understood risk management. They had a cost-benefit structure for their strategy. They had factored in the possibility of exposure, of partial discovery, of minor complications in the narrative. What they had not factored in, what they were constitutionally incapable of factoring in, was the cost of being on the wrong side of someone who has nothing left to protect. Because there is a very specific kind of dangerous that a person becomes when they have been stripped of the things they used to be careful about protecting. There is a freedom in having had everything taken that makes the truth cost exactly nothing to speak. Let me explain what I mean by that. Before the strategy deployed against you, you had things to lose, relationships you wanted to preserve, perceptions. You were invested in maintaining a version of peace that required you to keep certain truths quiet. Not because the truths were shameful, but because speaking them would have required a level of confrontation you were not ready for. A burning of bridges you were still hoping to repair. A closing of doors you were still trying to keep open. Your silence in that earlier period was not weakness. It was investment. You were protecting something, but they kept taking and taking and taking. They took the relationships, they took the perceptions, they took the peace, they took the open doors, and they slammed them one by one with their palms flat against the frames so you could hear each closure. And at a certain point, a very specific tipping point that feels different for every person, but is always recognizable in retrospect, you stopped having things that could be taken. And the moment you stopped having things that could be taken, you stopped having reasons to be careful. You became, in the truest possible sense, free. Free in the way that only someone who has been comprehensively stripped of everything they were once protecting ever becomes, because they were still playing the game where you had things to lose. Their entire strategy in its final phase was built around leveraging those things against you. Apply enough pressure to the right relationships, the right perceptions, the right opportunities, and you will maintain your silence indefinitely rather than risk losing what's left. What they missed is that by the time they deployed that final phase, there was nothing left to leverage. They had already taken it. They arrived at the negotiating table to find that you had no remaining stake in the negotiation. And a person with no stake in the negotiation has only one thing to offer: the truth. Here is where the story shifts completely. Here is the moment the entire dynamic of the last however many months inverts, like a negative film exposure where everything that was dark becomes light and everything that was light gets revealed as shadow. For the entire duration of their campaign, the scrutiny was moving in one direction. They were watching you. They were analyzing you. They were building case files in their heads, collecting evidence of your supposed flaws, documenting every instance where you appeared vulnerable or uncertain or reactive, treating you like a subject under observation rather than a person with the capacity for observation. They had the microscope. They had the lab coat. They had the clipboard. You were the specimen. But here is the thing about scrutiny that the scrutinizers always forget. While they were watching you, you were watching them. While they were analyzing your behavior, you were with every observation they made and every move they orchestrated, learning theirs. You were learning who they called first when they needed something covered. You were learning which alliances were transactional and which ones were built on mutual fear rather than genuine loyalty. You were learning the gaps between their public positioning and their private desperation. You were learning very specifically and very thoroughly exactly how their system worked, and now that the microscope has turned, what does it reveal about them? It reveals that the confidence was performance. It reveals that the alliances were held together by shared investment in a particular version of events rather than by any genuine affection or respect. It reveals that the certainty, that weaponized certainty that they wore like armor through the entire campaign, was at its core a kind of magical thinking, a collective agreement to believe something not because it was true, but because the alternative, acknowledging the truth, was too expensive for everyone involved. What the turning microscope reveals is not complexity or depth or sophistication. What it reveals is the oldest, simplest story in the world. People who felt small, making someone else smaller, and calling it strategy. You are not angry at this revelation. That is the most important thing, because anger would suggest that you expected better from them, that you are still operating on some level of surprise. But you are not surprised. You processed the surprise a long time ago, in the quiet, in the withdrawal, in the months of watching without speaking. What you feel now, standing in the new physics of this room where the microscope has turned and the sentence has been spoken and the empire has its first irreparable crack, is something closer to clarity. Clean, cold, absolute clarity, which as it happens is exactly the most dangerous thing you could possibly feel. We need to speak directly, briefly, specifically to the people who were recruited into the strategy against you. The ones who weren't architects, the ones who didn't design the blueprint but agreed to carry the bricks. The colleagues, the mutual friends, the acquaintances who were handed a version of you that had been carefully pre-processed, stripped of its context, deprived of your perspective, polished until it looked like objective observation rather than the manufactured narrative it actually was. The ones who made the decision consciously or through comfortable passive acceptance to receive that version of you as true without asking for your input. Here is the complicated grace of this moment for those people. They did not have access to the sentence you just spoke before you spoke it. They were operating on the information they had been given in the specific social context, where questioning that information would have cost them something: access, belonging, the warmth of the in-group that had recruited them. That is not an excuse. Adults are responsible for what they choose to accept as true without verification. But it is a context. It means that what is now required from them is not punishment, but decision. Some of them will make the right decision quietly. They will recalibrate without public announcement, without dramatic declaration, simply allowing a gradual restoration of something closer to fairness in how they treat you and speak of you. They will not apologize, not because they lack the capacity for it, but because apology requires admitting that a choice was made, and that admission carries its own costs that some people are not ready to pay. Accept this quiet recalibration for what it is. Accept the changed behavior without requiring the explicit acknowledgement, because requiring the acknowledgement closes the door to the changed behavior, and the changed behavior is ultimately what matters. And some of them will not recalibrate. Some of them will double down. Some of them, because their identity is now so deeply entangled with the version of events that your sentence disrupted, will find it genuinely impossible to absorb the new information without experiencing it as a threat to themselves. These people will require the architecture to remain standing even as it cracks around them. They will maintain the performance of certainty with increasing effort and decreasing conviction, and you will recognize them not by their loudness, but by the very specific quality of desperation that exists in a person who is working hard to believe something they have already privately begun to doubt. Now listen closely, because this section is the one that separates the people who survive this kind of thing from the ones who let it eventually consume them from the other direction. There are several things you are not going to do in the aftermath of the sentence. You are not going to celebrate loudly, not because you don't have the right to, but because loud celebration in this context is not victory. It is recruitment material for the people who need to reframe your justified sense of vindication as instability or arrogance, or proof that you were the aggressor all along. Your victory is not a performance. Your victory is a result. You are not going to explain yourself to everyone who is now suddenly available and curious, because the curiosity is not always interested in your truth. Some of it is information gathering. Some of it is people figuring out which side is safer to be on now that the balance has shifted. The sentence has already done its work. The sentence does not require a follow-up lecture. The sentence does not need to be expanded into a comprehensive case. The sentence stands alone, clean and precise, and anything you add to it dilutes its clarity. You are not going to go looking for the acknowledgement from the architects. This is crucial. This is the trap that swallows more people than any other at this stage. The moment you decide that what you need, what would complete this, is for the person who designed the strategy against you to admit that what they did was wrong, you have handed them a new lever, because they will withhold that acknowledgement for as long as they are physically capable of doing so, and you do not need it. Your clarity is not contingent on their confession. Your sentence was not a question waiting for their answer. And finally, you are not going to become what was done to you. You are not going to build a strategy. You are not going to curate a narrative. You are not going to whisper in hallways or recruit allies by delivering pre-processed versions of events, because the sentence worked not because it was strategic. It worked because it was true. Truth is not a strategy. It is a different category of thing entirely. It does not require architecture. It does not require maintenance. It does not crack under pressure. It simply exists, and it keeps existing, and it keeps working without your help.